Okay, video on politics this morning. Politics and the Latino Chicano experience in the 21st century. We read two things for this week, both of them creative pieces. One of them is a section of a novel, and the other one is a very, very famous poem by a young Latino writer from the 1960s. Both of these pieces have to do indirectly with the Chicano movement civil rights era, the enlightened area of young Mexican Americans and other Latinos who begin to push for political voice and presence in the early 60s on into the 70s. We've mentioned a couple of times already what we call the Chicano movement, and I'll give you a little bit of background on the importance of that time in the civil rights era of the United States. First of all, if we divide the 20th century, starting back in the beginning, early 1910s, basically, up until late 70s into the 80s, if we divide that into three distinct areas of Mexicans in the United States, it helps to understand the growth pattern in terms of what Mexicans in the U.S. have felt and how they have instigated themselves into American life. So if we talk first about the 10s and 20s, as what is often referred to as the immigrant era. And we mentioned during our immigration section that after the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, many Mexicans immigrated to the United States. And during that decade, 1910 to 1920, in fact, the population of Mexicans in the U.S. swelled. And the reason we refer to this time, the 10s and 20s, as the immigrant era is because largely the attitude of those immigrants while here in the United States was that this was a move of impermanence. The idea would be that they would eventually return to Mexico or their other Latin American homes after a certain amount of time. And so the things that they did while here were based solely on that idea. They kept close with other Mexicans and other Latinos. They spoke Spanish. The assimilation process was really quite minimal. They kept their own schools and churches and other small, sort of closed-off communities. And the phrase Mexico de afuera, or Mexico abroad, was largely what defined those people in the United States. They had an attitude of isolation, of non-integrationist policy, right? And so this immigrant era was the onset of the 20th century Mexican in the United States. I'm here, but I'm only here in this capacity, and I want to make sure that I can connect with other Mexicans and only marginally encounter the American world and culture when I need to. Okay, this gives way to the next period, which begins roughly in the 30s and goes roughly into the mid-1950s. Again, these periods are rough periods. They're not defined by any specific moment. But this era is probably more widely known as the assimilationist, or we call it the Mexican-American era. And during this time, the next generation of those immigrant families and the immigrants themselves began recognizing the added values of integrating or assimilating or adapting to the American culture around them. Okay, and so gradually inroads are made into schools and community centers and businesses and churches, and language becomes a key component of integrationist thought, right? The idea that I must speak English, I must adopt traits of American culture in order to full on be accepted as an American as just anybody down the street. And one of the big issues that happens during this period is, on a global scale, the onset of World War II. And in order to prove one's patriotism, one's loyalty to country, Mexican Americans, and many other minorities, by the way, enlisted in the military and participated in the national cause, both at home and in foreign service, service in foreign countries, to build the United States quest for freedom overall. And this was looked at as a very prideful, very loyal, patriotic proof of one's American identity for quote-unquote hyphenated Americans like Latinos at the time. And they saw this as a means of, look at how American I am. A couple of other issues during this era: name changes, language being hidden, adopting and dominating with Americanized traits over one's cultural ancestry was the norm. We hear a lot of people from this era who would have had their names changed by the system, or may have done it themselves, from something like Juana to Jane, or Guillermo to William. All of these things that make it easier to assimilate and to dominate, to merge into the dominant culture. Language disappears. You did not get anything with Spanish, and so it was not meant to be spoken outside of the home. And we look back to the author Richard Rodriguez, who talked about his public world, where he adopted one certain identity, and his private world, where he kept a hidden identity and really wanted to keep those two things separate. Mexican-American era did have its own goals and philosophies in terms of creating civil rights, but they were largely dominated by integrationist policies. That is, how can I get into the system that's existent and do it their way and make things better? And one of the huge proponents of this was a group by the name of LULAC, L-U-L-A-C, which is the League of United Latin American Community. LULAC, L-U-L-A-C. Okay? And their model was based on a slow, progressive changing of things from the top, rather than change below and radical, progressive changes in terms of policy and that sort of thing. So it was a very business-minded mindset. I'm sorry, I called it the League of United Latin American Communities. It's actually the League of United Latin American Citizens. It had a very American patriotic sense to it. Now that closes off the Mexican-American era, and that's goes into the 50s, into the mid-50s, when things begin to change and lean a little bit more towards the progressive. And this is that third era that we sometimes refer to as the Chicano era. And politically speaking, the Chicano era is an era where young people, now we're probably on third and fourth generation if we follow that immigration pattern, young people in the United States who have their only ties to their home countries are through familial and ancestral stories. They've now been born in the United States for generations. They begin to sense that all of that work done in the Mexican-American era to prove one's American loyalty and identity is being sort of dismissed by dominant parties. And they say, yeah, you're act American, but you're not full-on American. And so the young people at this time adopt a different, more radical attitude in terms of the other types of civil rights movements going on and demanding their voice and their presence be heard in whatever capacity they deem effective. And that begins the idea of the Chicano, Mexican or Latino ancestral traditions based in history, language, and other sort of customs, combined with their knowledge and experiences and full-on American upbringing, creates something entirely different. And up to this point, it had been not very desirable to be a mix, a hybrid of things. And Chicano movement recognized this as a moment to say, this is something that is identifiable, and it's valid, and it's who I am, and I can choose to be this way. I can choose to speak both Spanish and English. I can choose to acknowledge all of my components of my ancestry, white, Indian, Mexican, born in other countries, born here. I can choose to code switch between different types of Spanish and language, and I can represent myself and my interests in the face of not being labeled, well, you're not American enough or you're not Mexican enough. And this is really the onset of that Chicano movement. A term that we often associate with this is the two-word phrase, cultural sovereignty, which means I'm in charge. Sovereign meaning self-governing. I'm in charge of my own sort of cultural makeup and decide how I will be viewed by the rest of the community. This is the impetus for that political section of the Chicano movement. We've talked about labor with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the push for labor unions and more representation and fair wages and all of that. While the other two components of the Chicano movement are the youth, the students across campuses, we talked about in education, seeking more representation and more curriculum viability and all of that. And the last component is the political arena. And within this arena, many different voices stood up and sought representation. And there were even political parties and candidates put on ballots in local elections that were founded by Chicano movement leaders in order to seek out change and policy reform that was actually very, very much a part of the social movement. The two things we read for today have to do exactly with the activities of the movement. And I'm going to start with the more famous of the two, the poem I Am Joaquin by Rodolfo Corky Gonzales. Gonzales was a young, very outspoken, very loud and charismatic student leader. And in fact, he gets his name Corky Gonzales because he was smaller in stature but very animated and very, very brash in his attitude. And when he was younger, people used to say he would pop off all the time in his speaking, kind of like a cork. And so they nicknamed him Corky. And he was a very successful young boxer in the regional boxing circuit. And eventually he took all this energy and this sort of animation into leading young Latinos, students, college students and younger, in what came to be known as the Crusade for Justice. And he started out in Denver, but he would move through parts of the West and the Southwest and spread this message of reconnecting with your historical roots, and that being something that was okay. Up to this, it's hard to imagine, but up to this point it had been a thing that wasn't worth studying. It wasn't represented in history books. It wasn't well known. It wasn't an identity to seek out to be, Mexican American or Chicano. It wasn't something that was desirable. Instead, Gonzales and others began saying, resurrect this. Find out what these things are. Aslan, the idea of the Aztec home as a symbol, begins to be pushed as a cultural marker of finding out about one's historical ancestry. If you look at his poem, I Am Joaquin, and you understand that it's a performed poem, meaning it's not just meant to be read, but Gonzales performed this at many, many student rallies and meetings. You understand the idea he has when he begins, I am Joaquin. It's the first person subject that becomes more than just the individual speaker, but ultimately in the poem it becomes what we call the universal I. I is meant to stand in for other Chicanos. I am Joaquin, I am Cortez, I am all of these components of his past. And as I mentioned in the email, I would be amazed if you knew all of these historical references in there. Many of them are very obscure, and maybe you've heard of them, maybe you don't know exactly what they are, but there are a lot of them that we should recognize. Gregorio Cortez, Moctezuma, Hernando Cortez, on and on. These are historical figures that are part of the Mexican-American ancestral lineage. And the thing that is interesting here, there are several things, but the thing that sticks out most of all is the sense of conflict that exists in the poem. Because what he does is he mentions whites and Indians and mestizos as being all equal components of who he is, the I of the poem. Joaquin Murrieta, the man, the historical figure who the poem is named after, was an actual real 1850s rebellious figure. And Gonzales assumes this identity, and then he pours into other parts of his past, and he says, I am all of these things. I am equal parts the colonizer and the colonized, and I am also Indian as well, and I've been pushed off, and all of these things make up who he is. And what he does when he recites this, so try to imagine him reciting this to a group of college students, he makes them aware of the many, many components of their identities, Latino and Latinas, who they may not have ever encountered in their life. And it should instill a pride and an identity clearing up, right? It sort of muddies their past, but it also makes mention that this is who you are. And by the time he reaches the end of that litany of people and broken treaties and the mentions of art and culture being stolen, he gets to that last message of endurance. And this appears on the page in all capital letters. I shall endure. I will endure. And he repeats this over and over. And you could imagine the pride and the sort of swelling nature of the crowd as they receive this information. And Gonzales was very animated, like we said, but he's also very educated in terms of saying, recognize that this is who you are. And going forward, don't let anybody else tell you who it is that you have to be and what is worthwhile. This is who you are. On the flip side, the piece that we read about the cockroach people, the revolt of the cockroach people, is meant to be satirical. It's humorous. It's kind of a dark humor. Oscar Acosta, Zeta, they called him, was a very mysterious sort of psychedelic gonzo journalist in the likes of Hunter S. Thompson. And in fact, if you know who Hunter S. Thompson is, his very famous Dr. Gonzo character is based on his friendship and his companionship with Oscar Zeta Acosta. He was mentally unstable for most of his life, but he was very clear-headed in a lot of things. And he wrote these books about his own life and experience as a young lawyer working for the members of the Chicano movement, representing them, trying to instigate change and to point out class disparities and ethnic and racial disparities in the legal system. And he spent a lifetime doing this until he sort of mysteriously disappeared in Mexico in 1974. And he kind of disappeared under cryptic circumstances. They don't know. Maybe he was captured, killed by enemies. That it just kind of left a very mysterious tale beyond him. But anyway, in this section of his book, The Revolt of the Cockroach People, he displays a protest on a Christmas Eve service in a white, very rich, upper-class area. And outside are the cockroach people, the people who are like cockroaches. And this was a motif that Acosta and other writers and artists of the time would use to talk about the undesirables, the lower class, and the people who were not wanting or wanted around by the privileged. And within this, he makes satire of a lot of different things. He makes satire of money, obviously, but then he makes satire of the ritual, the goodness that these people inside the church are feeling, where outside they're sort of portraying their own ritual of sacrifice and recognition of their own desires, needs, and loss outside. And when they break through, it's supposed to be mildly comedic in terms of their exchange. There's sort of sacrilegious motifs, and there's the presence of the police officers who were waiting for them in the way that suggests that the system is already always on alert. And then in the midst of this is Acosta himself, the lawyer character who watches and who is even at one point put in a hands-off position, right? Because he is the lawyer. He's a little bit above class. And this is part of his struggle, I think, in the end of the story, that he, when he discusses this on the phone, he makes mention that I've upped the ante, and the person on the other end of the phone asks him if that's really what he had done. And it's kind of this questioning of, it's easier for him since he's in a hands-off position. Is he really full-on engaged? And this was something that Acosta himself struggled with, this grassroots organizer that maybe wasn't at a grassroots level. And so what exactly good was he doing? As I mentioned, both of these pieces come about being written in and about this Chicano movement time. It really marks a monumental step forward in terms of social action and political presence. Latinos have long held a sort of traditional conjunction with labor class, liberal thinking, though not solely. You do have Latinos in both primary political parties who speak to certain things, but the political presence and the political power of Latinos has gradually risen during this time, and today you'll see prominent Latinos in regional, local, and in some national circles who, while certainly addressing the major known issues that straddle all races and ethnicities, will also bring to mind individualized ethnic concerns from time to time, and they might address them in some ways, and they might very specifically not address them. So all of that to say that politics and the political voice of Latinos has been diverse, just like anything else, but has largely been affected by a need to cement the identity of who Latinos are and who they can say that they are historically, without having to compromise or be forced into a box to be represented by one specific identity.